Please welcome to the stage University of Colorado Graduate School Dean Scott Adler.
Good morning. Welcome. I'm Scott Adler, Dean of the Graduate School and Professor of Political Science here at CU Boulder. This morning's panel is Economics, Pricing, and Policy. How do governments and stakeholders pay for and take action to develop climate policy solutions in an equitable manner? As you've no doubt learned over the last few days of this conference, the University of Colorado Boulder is one of the world's leading institutions for research and education in climate sciences. We are both excited and well-positioned to host this conference and today's panel. Among the graduate school's 124 master's, professional, and doctoral degrees are many confronting and addressing the societal problems highlighted by the panels in the last few days. From atmospheric sciences to environmental engineering and sustainability politics, our students are learning from the world's best climate scholars and addressing the challenges facing our world right here and right now. This also means that among the 6,000 CU Boulder graduate students are tomorrow's climate scientists, climate thinkers, and climate change makers. I personally welcome anyone who wants to be part of what's happening at our great university here in Boulder. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience that many of the strategies for mitigating climate change have a very hefty price tag. At the same time, entities who will be tackling the climate crisis, governments, industries, citizens, and other stakeholders, have different responsibilities and means for that action. How do we sort out the differentiation in needs, responsibilities, and capacity for meaningful climate change? Luckily, we have a renowned panel of international experts to answer these questions. To get things started, I'll hand things off to our session moderator, Steve Baragona. Steve is an award-winning multimedia journalist covering science, environment, and health for Voice of America. His work has focused on the ways climate change impacts people, from the economy and policy to health and human rights. He has reported on the relationship between fighting climate change and the economy, how major disasters are linked to climate change, the Paris Agreement, and everything in between. Baragona joined VOA as an international health reporter from 2002 to 2004. He then spent 4 years as a communications and public affairs officer for the Infectious Diseases Society of America before returning to VOA as a food, agriculture, and nutrition correspondent. He assumed his current role as a science correspondent with VOA in 2013. Before his career in journalism, he spent 8 years in molecular biology and infectious disease research, eventually deciding that for him, writing about science was more fun than doing it. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a master's degree in journalism in 2002. Let me invite Steve.
So I'm a science reporter, but when you cover climate change, you quickly learn that you got to learn a lot of economics. This has been one of the most complicated and multifaceted kind of issues, and you can't focus on just the science. You'll miss a whole lot. So we have a lot to cover here. We've got 5 panelists. They're each going to focus on one of the many ways that we have to try to pay for all the changes we need to make. I'm going to keep introductions brief because we've got a ridiculous amount of, any one of these topics could take the full hour and a half. It's been the topic of many white papers, many PhD dissertations, and many hearings. So I'm going to dive right in here. We have 5 panelists. I'm going to start with Ying Chen. She is an economist with the New School. We have Kelly Sims Gallagher, who is a professor of energy and environmental policy at Tufts University and was an advisor to the Obama White House. We have Mercedes Garcia Perez. She heads global issues and innovation for the European Union delegation to the US. We have Kishore Rao, a consultant and global consulting sustainability and climate leader with Deloitte. And joining us through the intertubes is Walter Vergara, who's a senior fellow with the World Resources Institute, who heads the 20 by 20 initiative, which is focused on lowering the carbon footprint of land use change in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will take the far chair because I'm deaf in my left ear. All right, so first of all, we all had the opportunity to participate in a carbon market when we came to this conference. So show of hands, who bought the carbon offsets when you came? So I want to ask the panelists, so they paid for us. We didn't have to pay. But I want to ask the panelists, is this a good idea? Should we be paying for these kinds of offsets? Let's start with you, Kishore.
Yes, absolutely. And it's part of a kind of a voluntary carbon market system that allows individuals, companies, organizations to offset their carbon footprint by doing exactly that. So yes, it is useful.
So there's not everybody loves these kinds of arrangements. Some people will say that it's basically like buying indulgences, like back in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church would allow you to pay for your sins. We have all emitted greenhouse gases getting here. I flew here from Washington, D.C. I stayed in a hotel. I have a rental car. Those greenhouse gases are out there already. Convince me that this is a good idea, that after the fact I can go back and kind of offset my emissions. Mercedes, you think these are a good idea?
Absolutely. And in the European Union, as some of you might know, we have the ETS. This is the way we found to create our own carbon market. And we've used that money to finance measures. And we have realized this is actually the most effective measure to curb our carbon emissions. So by all means, we have to continue, learn the lessons from the system that already exists and keep doing it.
Kelly, thoughts?
I kind of have to disagree. The integrity of these offset markets is really the main concern that people have. And so for you to feel confident that the offset that you're buying is actually meaningful, has actually led to an emissions reduction somewhere else, is a very hard thing to do. And certainly most individuals, like all of us sitting here, cannot currently buy an offset with a high degree of confidence. However, I usually do it because most of the time there's positive co-benefits. So, there's a park that's being protected, or maybe biodiversity that's being protected, or some reforestation, even if we're not confident that the reforestation will be permanent. So I generally feel like it's worth doing it. And in high integrity markets, then I think you can feel really good about it. And I know that the European Union has been working on that.
Ying, your thoughts?
Yeah, I also paid because I think it's available and it's affordable to me personally. And I think it's a very smart way to raise people's environmental consciousness, just to, just through the process to understand what has happened and what has I done to incur carbon emission and what could be offset. And it also, I think, creates this sentiment that everyone is taking part of it. We're all in this together. But I also agree with what Kelly was talking about, is that I think there is also this concern about making people to feel like this is all what we need to do, and that's all, right? And I think we need to also realize that the ecological crisis cannot be sufficiently addressed just by changing individual consumption patterns, because whatever we consume is determined by what is produced, what we can access in the market. So I think it's very important to realize that there's also the other very important structural issues that we have to also consider that goes beyond the individual consumption choices.
And Walter.
I agree. I would add two important nuances. Yes, carbon offsets are a good idea, but I would suggest, as the European Union is doing today, that carbon offsets be only allowed under a process where the buyer, the enterprise that is buying carbon offsets, commits also to a process of decarbonization or net decarbonization by a certain time. That makes sure that the demand for carbon offsets goes hand by hand with a commitment to move towards zero carbon in terms of the Paris Agreement is described as 2050 as the goal. The other thing that I would say, the other nuance is that in this process of demand and supply of carbon offsets, we should facilitate the demand because the supply is already plentiful. There are many potential providers of carbon offsets in land use in Latin America. We should facilitate the demand for them, under the understanding that any corporate enterprise buying offsets should also be committing or be in a process already to decarbonize by mid-century.
So it cost me $25 to offset my emissions here for some reason. So there's a question of like, how do you come up with a price for the carbon emissions? And I think maybe, Kishore, we can start. It's hard to know with a crowd of this size how much people actually know about these things. So if you can just kind of give us the basics of like how exactly does a carbon market work? How do you set a price, and how do you set a use for the funds?
Yeah, I mean, carbon markets, it's sort of well known. There's basically a system for selling and buying and trading carbon credits and carbon offsets. There's a difference between the two. Carbon credits allow the owner of a credit to emit a certain amount, so it's like a permission slip. A carbon offset is really an organization or an individual like us can buy to decrease our own carbon footprint. And there's two types of markets, mandatory compliance markets, so regulated markets. The most prominent one is the ETS in Europe, in the EU, and Mercedes can talk about that. So you have norms, you have restrictions, you have a lot more scrutiny and verification, and you have unregulated markets, voluntary carbon markets, and that's where we see the most massive growth. Probably just in the last 2 years, a fourfold increase. So a lot of people are interested in this because it's a lot more fluid. It's not restricted to specific industries or sectors. You can buy and sell almost anywhere, but there's no formal system of regulation. And that's where most of the criticisms lie, Steve.
Let's talk about the European emissions trading system. This has been around for some time, right? This is one of the pioneering systems.
Yeah.
Give us a little thumbnail view of how it's working for you.
Okay, very, very briefly, it's quite a technical topic, but it's basically a carbon market that was created for the aviation industry, and that's how it's worked for the last 10 years or so. As I said before, it's been the most efficient measure we've had in terms of lowering our own carbon emissions and other gases. So it's efficacious, that we know. And it also works as a market because, for example, you can do with the offsets that are not used, at the beginning especially, and still today, there's some free allowances. So companies get free allowances, and then they only start paying when they go over those free allowances. But then there's a market for the allowances that they might have gotten and not used. So that creates also an additional market, and you can get a lot of money from that you can then invest in green technology, in social funds, and I'll get to that perhaps in a minute. So what we're going to do next, and that's the proposal that is in front of our legislature, which in our case is the Council and the European Parliament, so the governments of the European Union and the Parliament, the European Parliament representing our citizens, is to expand that to other markets, to the transportation market and to the buildings emissions. And that's where it gets really controversial because, of course, buildings means heating, and it means households, and it means offices and all that. So there's a big question of affordability there, so that we can also lower significantly our emissions in those two sectors, which are very, very significant, as you will know if you're interested in these topics.
Let's talk about that. You raised the issue of kind of affordability here. That I think the price in the EU went up considerably in the last few years. The price for carbon credits, and I know in places like California also has a carbon market. Now, energy is expensive in California for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the cap and trade system. And the criticism, excuse me, of all these programs is that they are by design intended to make energy more expensive, and therefore people will use less of it. But if you are someone who drives to work every day because you have a job at a supermarket or something, and you don't happen to live in public transit in a place like California, that is not unusual. This can raise the cost of your tank of gas, and as a poor person, this can take a big bite out of your pocketbook. So, talk to us a bit about these kind of equity issues and how you make something that is potentially a very regressive tax into something that achieves your purpose without doing excessive harm.
Just
Mercedes,
briefly, because I don't want to take everybody's time, but so we will also have, in parallel with this new ETS, a climate social fund. And that's directly to be able to use those revenues from the new ETS to subsidize, where necessary, the price of energy, in particular heating, for families who can will not be able to afford perhaps the higher prices that will be created by the new ETS. We've seen, and this is something I would have perhaps had to say at the beginning, Europe has stayed the course. I mean, despite the pandemic, despite the war in Ukraine, our energy prices are up 10-fold, 20-fold in some markets, but we haven't at all revised our climate targets. If anything, we're trying to accelerate the energy and the climate transition, because the more energy independent we get through renewables, the quicker we will be able to become independent from Russian oil and gas that we were importing in big quantities before. So we are trying to think ahead of the effects that this transition is going to have on especially the economy of families and small businesses, and we'll be able to use the revenues from that newly created carbon offset market, under the expanded ETS to subsidize energy prices where necessary.
I'd want to, we could talk all day about carbon markets, but I want to move on a little bit.
Before we do that, I would love to make two quick points.
Yes.
I think the first is that energy doesn't necessarily need to get more expensive. Just want to make sure everyone understands that, because you are penalizing the carbon or the CO2 emissions or methane emissions, the greenhouse gases. But if it's a clean fuel, like renewables, then they're benefiting. And so over time, in the European example, as Europe moves more and more towards renewable sources, costs actually will come down. And so that's the genius of the system. And then the other point I wanted to make is that whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade program, one of the crucial features of that is not just reducing the emissions, but also what you do with the revenue.
Right.
And so you can do a lot to address injustice, inequity through your revenue distribution. And I think that's a key thing to think about. And for people who are advocates to be advocating for appropriate use of those revenues. So we see in some systems, like in British Columbia, they actually just did a tax shift, and they they basically write a check to every citizen with the revenues that are generated to offset whatever higher costs they're experiencing in their energy bills. So there's a lot of ways that you can, and you could use it for something else entirely. Maybe in the US case, shoring up Social Security might be a choice that politicians make in terms of design of how to reallocate the revenues.
Another choice might be to protect forests
Exactly.
in the developing world. So that's a perfect segue. Walter, I'm terribly sorry about my throat here.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to make two points.
Sure.
A question about the economics. There is an economic cost of the emissions of a ton of carbon dioxide, and there is a financial price that the markets are setting up. The economic cost is growing up very quickly. A few years back, Laura Stern made a calculation of the damage caused to the global economy per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and it was in the hundreds of dollars per ton. Right. It is growing exponentially because as we move into 2 degrees future or even hotter future, the damages are increasing. So that's the first point. We have to be very clear that there is an economic cost and there is a financial transaction. Financial transaction, hopefully, at some point will catch up with economic costs. Otherwise, long term, we are in trouble. I would like also to echo what the last panelists mentioned. In Latin America, renewable energy is cheaper than gas, carbon, and of course, oil, heavy oil for power generation. And that cost continues to decrease. So for Latin America, going into renewable energy is the financial and economic way to go. Shifting quickly to land use, in Latin America, 58% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use or land use change. So in that context, it is very critical to reduce those emissions. And that's what Initiative 2020 does. It has a goal of reaching 250 million hectares by mid-century, which would equal at today's carbon footprint in the region, in Latin America. I'm always talking about Latin America, 60% of the total regional footprint, 3 gigatons per year. Luckily, land use-based actions are also the cheapest to reduce emissions. They are cheaper than many other actions in the economy, so another reason to go in that way. Initiative 2020 has already sponsored about 24 million hectares in land use interventions. There are 200 different projects, and we expect that by 2030 there will be 50 million hectares under intervention. Under intervention means conservation, reforestation, landscape management, and low carbon agriculture.
Could you give us an example of one of these programs? You've talked about carbon concessions. How does this work?
Yeah, this is a very exciting field. It's relatively new. A carbon concession, the best way to think about it is a timber concession. In a timber concession, you assign the responsibility to take out the forest, take out the wood from a parcel of land against a royalty paid to the state. This is a private enterprise, could be also public enterprise, and they are given the right to extract the timber. Well, there is no sustainable timber operation that I know of. So it's very important to shift that quickly. And what we are seeing is that a few examples of very promising shift to carbon concessions. Replace the word timber by carbon. And what you have is a system that can be linked to the European market, carbon market, could be linked to a regional carbon market, where the revenues will come from carbon offsets, from CO2 removals or conservation of carbon equivalent on the ground. That's in essence a carbon concession. We already have a few in Latin America by partners to Initiative 2020. The largest, most successful is by Permian Global in Rondônia in Brazil, 146,000 hectares of carbon concession already in place, with benefits being accrued by the local indigenous community, of course, by the investor or the concessionaire, with a royalty paid to the state that is excess of what they used to get for timber concessions. There are other carbon concessions already on the drawing board. I see carbon concessions as a winning strategy to make effective carbon removals from the atmosphere and conserve carbon on the ground.
So I got a question about how these actually work on the ground for the people who, who used to cut down these trees and sell them on the market. What are those folks doing in a carbon concession? Like, those are jobs, right? Those are people whose livelihoods depended on cutting down trees. how do you replace that with an economy that is based on preserving, restoring, and enhancing a forest?
Very good question. And this is at the key of the financial viability of carbon concessions. Those jobs that were not sustainable in the long term, the lumberjacks, because the trees at some point disappeared, are replaced by people that monitor the forest, people that exert some sort of governance, vigilance around the carbon concession, people that are working on documenting changes in the baselines for carbon and biodiversity, and also services to the community. Because with the prices in today's market are about 70 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, you could have a very good, hefty business based on carbon concessions. So your question is good, very good indeed. Those non-sustainable jobs are replaced by assignments that are correlated to the health of the forest.
So my job here is to be the wet blanket, and some of these forest carbon programs have had a bit of a troubled history. I was surprised the first time I went to one of the COPs to see the cadre of folks railing against REDD, the old reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation. Talk about this as a form of colonialism. You've got rich countries, like us. We get to pay to continue to emit greenhouse gases, while on the flip side, then we get to tell developing countries how to use their land, and people don't like that. How do you address those kinds of concerns with these kinds of programs?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, look. As I said before, in Latin America, 58% of all emissions come from land-based actions. Conserving the forest has a number of financial and economic benefits: social, environmental, other environmental, and of course, climate benefits. I think most of the countries in Latin America, including the current Brazilian administration, understand that conserving the forest is the way to go, that it will accrue in substantial economic and financial benefits for the nations. And they include conserving the biodiversity, maintaining surface hydrology, making sure that the weather is stable in regions in Brazil. A parenthesis on that, there is growing evidence that cutting the forest is affecting the agricultural belt in southern Brazil. You cut the forest in the north, there is a river of moisture that goes from north to south, south of the equator, and that river of moisture in the atmosphere is being affected by the destruction of the forest. So there is also an economic benefit, strong economic benefit in maintaining the forest for the purposes of sustainable agriculture. All in all, keeping the forest in place is a winning proposition. And Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil understand that, and the growing awareness that a tree on the ground is much worth, is valued much more than a tree cut is the winning proposition.
So again, this is another topic that we could spend hours on, but I want to, unless anybody has anything they want to toss in before we move on real quickly to banks. All right, Kelly, another place we get money for, especially in low and middle income countries, is development banks. We have a history. These banks have done a lot to try to mobilize money to make transitions into more sustainable energy sources, but there's an argument that these banks are not equipped to handle the new world. That climate change presents a unique challenge. This is something that has come up, kind of the buzzword now is the Bridgetown Agenda. But before we talk about the Bridgetown Agenda, give us a sense of what's been going on in these countries. Like, how do they feel that the development banks have been failing low and middle income countries that are on the front line?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that a lot of developing countries, through a combination of all the different factors that are happening in the world today, are experiencing rising levels of debt. And their indebtedness, they feel like they're in a bit of a debt trap because we've got recessionary pressures in the global economy, high energy prices because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, rising food prices, and then on top of everything, a lot of climate damages are starting to emerge. So the most stark example, I think, this past year was in Pakistan, where you had massive monsoon flooding, covered 1/3 of the territory of Pakistan. 33 million people were displaced. 552 children were killed during those floods. And the estimated damages by the World Bank so far are $40 billion. So what happens when a country like Pakistan, a less developed country, has a kind of catastrophic climate event like that? They have to go and borrow more money to be able to recover from that disaster event. And this is becoming this vicious cycle for a lot of developing countries. And the Bridgetown Agenda has arisen out of that. Now, in that case, this came out of Barbados, and the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has really led this charge. And of course, there, the climatic damages are a little bit different. They're experiencing these supercharged, very powerful hurricanes over and over and over again, creating again this cycle of indebtedness. Maybe it would feel most dramatic if you think about the case of Haiti, which has just never been able to recover from the combination of earthquake and hurricane and so forth. So I think these countries are just feeling like there's no way out for them, that they are stuck now in this vicious cycle, and they're trying to now advocate for changes to the institutions, what we call the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and other development banks, so that they are give these countries a chance, really, to experience sustainable economic development.
Can you give us a little thumbnail sketch of how things would change under the Bridgeport Agenda?
Yeah, I think the specific request in the Bridgetown Agenda for the IMF is that they would increase or rechannel what's known as the special drawing rights. This is basically money that the countries can have access to, and that they can get access to it much more quickly without a long bureaucratic review procedure, so that in the event of a major disruption, they can quickly access the funds they need. They would like interest charges to be suspended in the case of a climatic event. I mean, this is happening not because they did anything. Most of these countries are extremely low emitters. And so it's not like they caused the problem. It was really everybody else who emitted the greenhouse gas emissions. And then for the development banks, they've asked them to significantly increase their lending for truly sustainable development, sustainable in all of the ways we might think of it. The specific ask is to increase lending by $1 trillion. Let me just sort of bring this down, make this a little bit easier to think about. So if I asked you, everyone in the audience, to just, for a minute, since the Paris Agreement was passed or adopted in 2015, how many renewables projects do you think the World Bank has supported around the world? Just put a number in your head. So since 2015, how many renewables projects have been supported by the World Bank? The answer is 191. So I don't know if that seems like a lot or a little. It all depends on your perspective. But I think most of the developing countries would say that doesn't even come close to serving the needs that they have to make this transition to cleaner energy. And of course, the World Bank is not the only development bank, but it's a big one. It's a symbolic one. And earlier this year at Climate Week in New York, the president of the World Bank declined to even acknowledge that climate change was a real problem, that it was a significant challenge. So I think we do have some real, problems here in our global economic development system that need to be addressed. And this really means mainstreaming climate into the operations of these development finance institutions to enable developing countries that really are interested in pursuing a cleaner, low carbon, resilient growth path to actually be able to finance that kind of economic transition.
Yeah, I wonder, there's a very good episode of The Daily that was just on a few days ago that goes through this whole thing, and they take 45 minutes to do it. So unfortunately, we can't spend that kind of time. But one thing that they really pointed out in that episode was that this is, in addition to the development banks, they're really trying to free up private capital to do this too. Can you talk about how that works and why that's important?
Well, I mean, there's a limit to how much public money is available. So if we think about where do the development banks get their money, it's from contributions from their shareholders. So the United States is the largest shareholder, for example, of the World Bank. And where does that money come from? Our tax dollars, right? So I think there is only so much public money that's going to be available to help developing countries with this transition. So we certainly are going to need the private sector to step up and stop funding and investing in high carbon infrastructure and to start investing in and being part of the solution. And right now there's almost no accountability for that. And I think that's a real challenge. I want to make one more point just about kind of the cost benefit calculation here as we think about it from a taxpayer point of view. In the United States, Hurricane Ian, which was the big hurricane we experienced earlier this year, was also estimated to cause $47 billion in damages. So in these two countries alone, Pakistan and the United States, in these two events alone, we're up to $87 billion in damages. And to put that in perspective, the goal that developed countries were supposed to mobilize $100 billion in funding. So we're almost at the same, like in parity with just two events. So the worse we let things get, the more these damages are going to accrue, and we're going to be putting a lot of bad money after this problem rather than investing in the prevention in the first place. I just think that's something that many people don't understand yet, is that we're already paying for the costs of climate change. In the US, since 1980, we've had $338 billion plus disasters, which together have now added up to $2.2 trillion. And that's our taxpayer money that's going out the door to help pay for this disaster recovery.
Steve, if I could.
Yeah,
yes,
please. Yeah.
Two very quick points. As the panelists just said, public money is not the solution. There is why, because there's limited amount and the size of the problem, the financial requirements exceed what World Bank, IMF, plus IDB, plus the African Bank can put together. So the solution has to come from the private sector.
Correct.
And the key for that is to demonstrate that the climate solutions pay off, that they illustrate a better route for development. That's the case of Latin America. The levelized cost of energy from energy generation, from wind, solar, geothermal, is much lower than for gas, carbon, oil. So that's the way to go. Private sector is investing already in Latin America on renewable energy resources. That's the solution. The second point I want to make is that the special drawing rights are limited to either country. So
Correct.
that solution really doesn't percolate to the entire community. So again, the solutions have to come from the private sector. Luckily, the financial mechanisms are illustrating that climate sound solutions are cheaper than the traditional fossil fuel solutions. That's the case for Latin America, at least.
Kishore, I hear you nodding vigorously.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything that's been said, but it's the private sector and the ingenuity and the funding that has to solve this problem, along with other players. And so, you know, it comes back to one aspect of this is voluntary carbon markets. So you see this massive interest of funders, of companies wanting to participate in this, and everyone's looking for high quality projects. And so part of what is being done is the market is filling that need. So you have now standards like setters bodies, like Gold Standard or Verra, and there are a number of them that are creating these sort of certification of some of these projects to make sure that there's additionality in the projects, to make sure that there's the kind of impact on and participation by indigenous communities. And if I may, so in COP27, there was a huge opportunity. Everyone was waiting for this. Our clients, our corporate clients, governments, is what was going to come out of Article 6. Article 6 is sort of an arcane piece of the agreement, but it really underlies a lot of what private sector and others can do in terms of carbon pricing, carbon markets, and really high quality projects. This was punted to the next COP. But the private sector is not waiting. So a lot of our work in the corporate side is helping companies basically come up with prices for carbon for their internal transformation. So sort of like a social price for carbon that our panelist was talking about. Internally, there has to be a price that's sufficient, that can be attached to your transformation, that there's a business case to make the kinds of investments that need to be made for the transformation that's available. So I just stopped there to say, and I'm sure my panelists have lots of examples of the private sector stepping into this space.
Yeah. Ying, I wanted to move to you. Mercedes, go ahead.
Just a quick point on one thing that we've done in the European Union that I wasn't planning to talk about, but I think is very relevant to what you just said. We have a green taxonomy, and it's a non-compulsory legal instrument, but it creates clarity on what, under European Union law, we consider a green investment. And that, of course, has great importance for businesses to be able to say, we are, at least according to this verifiable standard that is applied at least throughout the European Union, but we very much hope that it will become a global standard. This is actually a green investment. So these measures to create transparency are very important. And then the other thing we did already some years ago is to start asking companies to disclose their climate risks. And we know the SEC is working in a similar measure now, and we just got briefed about it. It's very interesting. We've been doing this for a while now, only for the biggest corporations incorporated in Europe, asking them to disclose actually not only their climate risk, their human rights risk as well in their investments abroad. And now we have a wealth of information on what's going on out there that we can build on as well in terms of our next regulations. Thanks.
So Ying, I wanted to talk, we've been talking a lot about climate finance, and I also want to get into this idea of climate reparations. Harms have been done, and generally there's a principle that the folks who are responsible for the damages pay for the consequences. Tell us a little bit about, what is the difference exactly between climate finance and climate reparations?
Thank you very much for the question. So a lot to be said, but I want to say I think there's this two broad categories of terms that refers to the kind of money that we need to pay to compensate for all the kind of loss and damage that has been incurred because of the climate crisis. And I think loss and damage, climate reparations, ecological debt, climate debt are the terms that we can, the minute we see it, we can see there's a very clear political message within it, right? The political message is that we know what the root cause is, and we know who is responsible for it. So it's very clearly political. But there's also this term, climate finance and things like that, that are more technical, right? Ahistorical and apolitical, that tends to, tends to depoliticize the whole thing and to make the question, to frame the question in a way that the scope of the solution would be narrowed into only technocratic solution. Not to say that it's not important, but to say that it's probably not sufficient enough, given that the crisis we're facing now is really a structural crisis, not just about ecology, not just about non-human nature, but also related to the overall economic system about how things are being produced and how things are being distributed. So I personally would prefer to see terms, welcome to see terms like loss and damage, climate reparation, just because it has a very profound, I think, inclusion of the historical and the political dimension of it. And that's why I think the establishment of the Loss Damage Fund from the recent COP27 was very welcoming thing to see. Another thing I want to just comment a little bit, since colleagues here have talked a little about carbon pricing and carbon markets, which is also related to the climate finance and reparation topic, is that, I mean, I'm trained as an economist, and I have been following the kind of contributions that economists have made to the narratives and discussions of climate change. And I have to say a lot of the contributions are not very constructive. Not very long time ago, we hear renowned economists would say, things like it actually makes economic sense to dump waste to the global south because the cost of the pollution is just much cheaper there, right? We would also hear economists like mainstream economics policy recommendation to be just keep growing because we have this environmental Kuznets curve. Just keep growing, everything's going to be fine because eventually we're going to reach this peak point, when the economy is growing fine, and then we have enough technological resources to just address ecological concern. So I think those are all, now we can see very clear problematic recommendations. But it's not because the economists are ill-advised or they lack information, but it's because the theory that is guiding them to make that kind of policy recommendation, I think, is flawed, is problematic. And I think one of the things we can name it out is that it was founded on the neoclassical economic theory, which focuses mostly on market exchange and views people as market participants. And everyone has equal social power, no matter what kind of endowments you bring to the market for exchange. Everyone was conceived as having relatively equal power, and therefore people make choices with response to price signal. And the result is that we're going to have a very efficient market exchange, very efficient market outcome. So whatever went wrong, things like economic crisis or ecological crisis, right, must happen outside exchange. The reason must be that the price is wrong. So the remedy is to get the correct price. So I think that's the guiding theory that leads us to the discussion of finding the correct price, which is very important. But I also want to point out that no matter how objective and scientific it might sound, the literature actually doesn't have a consensus on what the correct price is. The idea is to try to take into consideration the social cost of production. But based on people's subjective understanding of the economy about how fast technological innovation could be, the correct price that have been proposed ranges from $1 to $200 per metric ton. So no consensus at all, right? That's the theoretical understanding of the correct price. But on reality, in the practical world, many scholars have also been trying to, I was just chatting with Kalyan, that many scholars have been trying to actually work out what is the price floor, the minimum price that is needed to make sure there's limit on carbon emission. And the proposal was about $75 to $100. Mm-hmm. But in reality, I don't know how many of you are aware, the average global carbon price is only $3.
Right.
So it's much, much lower than what could have been, what need to be, to make things effective. So in that sense, according to the theory again, what we need to do is to make sure the market is more global so that there's no carbon leakage. So people cannot outsource their capital just to another country to take advantage of the cheap carbon cost there, right? So the idea is to create this very harmonized market, and so that everywhere the carbon price would be same, so nobody can take arbitrage of that, right? So I think that's a very good idea. Again, it might take decades to achieve. And I think it's very important to realize the question we are facing here is a very urgent question of climate crisis, and we are seeing the damage and the loss before our very own eyes. So can we really afford to wait so long before a perfect market to emerge? So I think that's the question here. I think the point that I want to highlight really is that we should be very careful about not framing the question as a technocratic question, as just a technical question, but understand the political nature of it.
So the costs of let's say loss and damage are, some estimates put them in the trillions.
Trillions, yeah.
Maybe even hundreds of trillions. It's big.
Yeah, it's right.
It's big.
Right.
So, and the COP27, we had an agreement to talk about a loss and damage fund. I'm curious what given the record that developed countries have of paying what they say they're going to pay. We're talking about, we haven't even gotten to $100 billion worth of climate finance.
Right.
What do you think of the agreement that came out of COP27? Just acknowledging that, yes, might be a nice idea for us to establish a loss and damage fund. What do you make of that?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not. I mean, what I said just now. I mean, it's not just to to say simplistically, just by naming it differently, we're going to get what we want, right? So in that sense, I think it's very welcoming to see the loss of damage fund to be established. I think next year there's going to be representatives from 24 countries to start discussing how that will exactly be, what the form of fund would be, who will pay, how much, right, and what form of payment. So the details will be worked out. But I think it's very important to acknowledge that. First of all, what you said was that the estimates would always be very controversial. I mean, you said about trillions. What I read was about around 500 billion by 2030 and around 1 trillion by 2050. But again, I think this is the technical part of it. I don't think we ever find a correct price tag for it, but I think it's very important to realize that the controversy in measuring the cost of it shouldn't be used as an excuse to delay the process, because the further you delay, the higher the cost it will be. It's just as simple as that. And the second thing I think it's very important to realize, because you talk about the political willingness of the governments to really be held accountable, which is a very important question. I think, again, I as an economist, but I wanted to say that I think it really depends on the overall political climate. So it's really not about experts, the ideas that they have. Because if you look at the history of ideas, in economics particularly, there are ideas and policies that are being proposed sometimes decades before it became mainstream, it became dominant, it was implemented. So it's more important to have this overall political climate and the reality that is confronting you to compel you to think that this is the policy we have to take now, right? So in that sense, I think the hope is really not on just the experts that are going to be negotiating details. They're going to play a very important role for sure. But I think it's also very important that everyone in this room, academics, journalists, people from private, public sectors, students, activists and all that, we're all in this together, and we're all in this to contribute to the overall political climate that will shape the kind of decision that will be made. So I think that's something that I want to highlight here.
Kelly.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say, I think it was very symbolic that this fund was established, but I'm very skeptical that it's going to end up, really being able to pay the true damage. I mean, we just talked about, 2 events this year that brought us to nearly $100 billion in damages. The damages are going to overwhelm our ability to pay soon. But I do think in the next year, as we talk about how to operationalize this new fund, a crucial question that we have to confront is who will pay. Not just for this fund, but also for mitigation and for adaptation and all of the other climate finance related needs. And I think, to me, there's 2 important things that are uncomfortable to talk about, but that need to be put on the table. And one is that in the context of the global negotiations, we've had a bifurcation between a certain set of countries that are known as the industrialized countries and then everybody else, which is the G77 and China. And up until now, only the industrialized countries have been obliged to provide climate finance. in all of its form, whether it's loss and damage or, support to multilateral development banks or whatever. But we do have a set of now middle-income countries or even upper middle-income countries that don't have any obligations to help pay in to provide some of this finance. I think China is a good example of a country that is in a very different place today in 2022 than it was in 1992 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. And while China has voluntarily said it would pay into a South-South fund, there's been no accountability around paying into that fund. Or we can think of where the negotiations will be held next year. The UAE is another example of the type of country that I think should be paying into these funds as a major fossil fuel producing country. So I think we have those types of countries, and then we have the private sector. Who's been profiting all these years, and what is their obligation to pay, and how are they going to start paying in? And that's a really important question. And I think there's a lot of ways we could approach that. There's a way to regulate the private sector to do that. There's also a way to tax the private sector to create these revenues and be able to support these. But we have to confront these difficult, and they're going to be uncomfortable discussions. And it's starting to get to be a little too late. So we need to do it now.
Yeah. Again, another topic that we could spend an entire conference on. But I wanted to move on to one other issue, which is that in this transition, there are going to be winners and losers. And there are people who are going to be left behind. And there are some efforts in a number of countries, and the EU being one block of countries, to deal with what's come to be called the just transition. And so the EU has started this just transition fund. And I wonder if, Mercedes, you could, I know it's new, but maybe you can explain to us, a country or a region of a country that would be interested in getting these funds and why and how it might help.
Thank you. Yes, this was one of the aspects and one of the measures that was introduced right at the beginning of this financial cycle that for us runs from 2021 to 2027. So we're at the beginning of the financial cycle. The regulation was established last year, and this was the first year of operation. One of the things we realized is that we couldn't really impose solutions on the communities that are going through this transition. So the first thing that is still going on is a huge consultation process. The regions that have these issues are already identified. I mean, it's very clear that coal regions, regions where they have big carbon economies, were going to suffer. So overall, the fund is already clear. It can benefit any of our member states, but we already know that the majority of it will be spent in Poland, in Germany, in the Czech Republic and Romania, places where these carbon economies are currently very, very wide and employ a lot of people, whether it's on the mines or also in the electricity producing and all that. One example that is already there is not from any of these 4 countries, is the Midlands in Ireland. 28 million euros have already been earmarked 84 million euros have already been earmarked for the Midlands. It's a peat producing region, and electricity is being produced from peat. It's a very sparsely populated population, so they live in small places far away from each other, so they have mobility issues as well. What's great about these funds is that it's not only the European Union that comes in, but it's co-financed. So the government that wants to benefit from these funds also have to bring in some of their money. So overall, it's not just going to be the 84 or so millions from the EU. It's going to be in total more than 150 million euros because the government of Ireland is also going to put some of their money. And this money is going to go into the creation of small, medium enterprises, into mobility, clean mobility for these communities, because it's the kind of place where if you don't have a car, it's difficult to move around. Hopefully, these communities will will find it easier to move away from peat production, and also obviously the cleaning of the current exploitation of the areas that are already there, because you cannot, and that's, I think, stranded assets is a big area of work as well for these communities. You don't want to leave mines open that might contaminate the environment. You don't want to leave oil wells that can contaminate the environment and all that. So I think that's a big area of work as well. So that's the internal side of the just transition mechanism. There's also an external dimension, of course, that I'm happy to comment about.
So one of the favorite stories I've done in recent years is right here in Craig, Colorado, which is kind of up in the northwest corner here. This is a town that has a coal mine, a coal-fired power plant, and really nothing else. And the state has passed a law that basically says, the consequence is going to be that we're going to close the coal plant and we're going to close the coal mine. And obviously, we wouldn't be here if we didn't think that this was important. But the folks who work at that coal plant, I talked to them, and when they talk about a just transition, they don't want it. They don't want a just transition. They're doing just fine. Where, as far as they're concerned, this is a just transition would be you transition to thinking about something else. So how do you get these, these stakeholders whose, this is their livelihood? How do you get them to the table for something like this?
And it's a very tough question. I mean, I remember when my country, Spain, joined the European Union, there were a lot of coal mining areas in North Spain, which already at that time had to close. It was part of the process of accession. And it was obviously good for the economy of the country to get into the European Union, but it was not necessarily good, as you say, for those families. What was done at the time was that people were basically paid to retire. So they continued to receive their salary, but they had retired from their jobs. And it was good for the economy of the families and the villages and the cities. I don't think it was particularly good for the social environment because, of course, that you no longer had a parent in each family that was actually going to work every day. So it's not necessarily the best solution. It was what was found at the time. I'm talking in the 1980s. And I think what you really need to find alternative economic possibilities. And these, sadly, are not always going to be in the same place. And that's the main bind. That's the main issue. If you're not going to if you want to work for offshore wind, obviously that's not going to be in the same physical place as your coal mine. So ideally, you need to find different solutions. I am aware of a wonderful project, for example. It's not in a coal area, but in an industrial area that transitioned, away from heavy industries, steel smelters, and stuff like that in northern Spain. You might be aware of the existence of a Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Now, the Guggenheim in Bilbao is proposing to create like a branch of the museum in one of the estuaries. And this used to be a big industrial area in the past. So there's plenty of abandoned buildings that used to be, all sorts of manufacturing industries that are no longer viable. So they were proposing to create a branch of the museum occupying some of those abandoned buildings and creating mobility solutions to go from that place to other places in the estuary. And that, if approved, will be also financed by some of these, that's called the Next Generation EU funds, and also co-financed by the government of Spain and the regional government. So you need to really be creative, and you cannot impose solutions to the communities. They have to come up with their own solutions. But I think the way to bring them into the table is saying, okay, this might be a job for you, but it's not the future for your children and your grandchildren. So they need to understand that this economy that is now there, it's not going to be there for the future. So once you admit that, you start thinking, okay, what's next for my community?
Can I?
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
We'll come back to you, Kishore, and then and then Walter, and then Q&A. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask here. But
so just a quick point to say that one of the power of the just transition is it allows other ecosystem players to participate, especially the private sector. So many oil and gas companies, many polluters that have benefited from this are looking and adopting a just transition lens for their transition and their participation in this. But I think we've done some early work that suggests that some of the new energy infrastructure that's going to be built whether it's hydrogen storage or hydrogen production, or whether it's carbon capture and storage facilities. Many of these, it makes economic sense to do this in areas of existing fossil infrastructure. It's more cost effective. You can create the kind of energy hubs that you want. So I think we're really at the beginning of seeing what will come out of this whole effort.
Very quickly, because I think that's such an important question. It really shows why it is important to see the ecological question not as a single issue, but related to labor issue, related to gender issue, and all the other issues in the economy as a whole. So I think that's actually something that the Green New Deal, the Global Green New Deal, was trying to tackle, which is not just to think about green transition in terms of the technological transition, but also in terms of massive investment to create new jobs in the renewable energy sector so that there are enough employment opportunities for people to transfer out of the fossil fuel industry, and also to provide skill training so that they can transfer smoothly. So I think that's very important. But that's probably more likely to happen in more wealthy countries. But in the global south, maybe there's lack of resources to do that. I mean, I've written papers on that very issue, and I was using China as an example. And China was not even the poorest country at all. I mean, China actually was now the #1 leading investor in renewable energy in the world. So the technological constraint and financial constraint was tackled. But even that, my calculation shows that, yes, with a green transition, you can actually generate twice as many jobs in the green sector versus what you lose from the fossil fuel sector. But all the new jobs, within all the new jobs, more than 50% are in the informal sector. And this is going to be a very typical phenomenon throughout the developing world. So if you don't address the pre-existing inequality, then even with a renewable energy transition from the technological perspective, all the other inequality will perhaps still persist. So I think that's why the question was so important for us to realize, all the things need to be considered simultaneously, comprehensively.
Walter, I want to get to you but I have a follow-up for Ying.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting paper, and I saw, but it was behind a paywall.
Oh, I'll send it to you.
So when you talk about the informal sector, I think of street food vendors. Like who is working in the informal sector in green jobs? Excuse me.
So yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, the technical definition, really, there are so many definitions of it. I think ILO has its own definition regarding the size of the enterprises, and street vendor definitely is included. I think in China, more than street vendors, there are also informal workers in the sense that they are short-term, contract-based. They're paid low wage. They have very little social protection. So you could say basically everything outside the formal sector would be considered as informal. So in that sense, construction sector, absolutely. Transportation sector. That's why we have so many generation of job opportunities in those sectors that would be considered as green jobs, but they're not, by nature, green at all.
It's an issue in the solar sector in the U.S. as well.
Absolutely.
They're not great jobs in many cases. Walter, you wanted to chime in here.
Very quickly, yes, I agree with the panelists, the gist of the comments, but let's put this into context. For Latin America, again, last year we completed an analysis of job creation through the decarbonization of the power and transport sectors. And the numbers, by mid-century, you would have created 31 million jobs, additional jobs, if you move all the transport sector to electric transport and all the power sector to renewable energy. And you would lose 5 million jobs associated to the operation of the refineries, associated to the operation of the gas power plants. So from an economic perspective, there is a clear winner. Yes, there are losers. There are 5 million losers. There are 31 million winners. Another number in context. This decarbonization of transport and power would represent annual benefits for the regional economy of $450 billion. So clearly, from a macro perspective, this is the way to go. There are losers, but it's better to announce that these jobs will be lost. It's better to provide sunset provisions for refineries and gas power plants today, so they know these jobs will not be there forever. An anecdote that I want to show you in the past is the spotted owl controversy in the 1970s in the west coast of the United States. There was this argument that, oh, the lumberjacks would, the lumberjacks will lose their jobs. But if they don't lose their jobs, the spotted owl will disappear. Guess what? Through a training process in the state of California, most of those jobs migrated to other sectors, and the spotted owl has continued to exist. So there are losers, but from a perspective, the welfare of the economy, the welfare of our planet, those losses better be accrued. And the signals that those jobs will be lost should be sent now.
All right. Again, with all these topics, we could go on forever, but I wanted to get some questions from you folks. I think we've got microphones that are going to go around. I've got some from the panel too. So where are we with our mics? Hold that thought. I've got a couple of, while we get our mics, I've got some questions that people submitted ahead of time. Let's see. Got one here. As speakers have said, climate investments in the global south would pay off for the private sector. And this has to be part of the solution. Yet there is an enormous mismatch between what's happening and what's needed. Among the problems I see here are short-termism and an unwillingness to truly challenge the global north versus global south inequalities that have been key to the business models of multinational corporations. What can solve this? Who wants to take that one on? Kelly, why don't you, I'm going to put you on the spot here. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, almost everything I've been talking about has been, different techniques and methods to try to address some of these injustices. I mean, I think that the essence of the challenge now is that we have a lot of developing countries that are still coping with deep poverty. We have more than 700 million people in the world who still don't have access to electricity, and even more who don't have access to clean cooking fuels. So there's like this dissonance where, we're talking in advanced industrialized countries like the United States and Europe about how we can rapidly reduce our emissions and help provide financing to developing countries. But most developing countries are primarily preoccupied now with the development process. They're trying to bring people out of poverty and undertake economic development. And there isn't a good low carbon development model that they can look at and say, oh, that country figured out how to do it. We can, practice the American development model. Or they might, look at China and say, the China development model is a great development model for bringing people out of poverty, but it caused 200 billion tons of emissions over 20 years. So that's not a good low carbon development model. And I think countries in the North have an obligation not only to provide this finance that I've been talking about, but also to help devise this new economic growth model. Because if they don't, just to be pragmatic, not only is it deeply unfair, but we're going to have a big new wave of emissions from these developing countries because they're going to pursue development anyway. I think that's going to be their top priority. And we need to find a way to help them develop in a clean and sustainable manner. We need to finance it, and we need to help them develop those solutions.
Great.
If I could very quickly.
Yeah, please, Walter.
Yes. There are 3 countries in South America, 2 countries in South America, and 1 in Central America that have gone zero carbon for the power sector already. Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile, which is in the process of reaching that point. These 3 countries have committed to full decarbonization by mid-century. So yes, I agree with what the panelists said, but there are models being developed in the South that provide an alternative to those carbon-intensive economies of the past.
All right, looks like we've got mics. Okay, ma'am, want to introduce yourself and?
Hi, My name's Carol Ben-Bassad, and I'm actually an international transactions lawyer. And my question for any and all of you is, what effect do you think political pushback against, for example, ESG, which is going on right now in the United States, might have on some of these development projects? I mean, the state of Texas pulled out of, their money out, and 2-3 days ago, the state of Florida pulled $2 billion out of BlackRock because they don't like ESG.
Yeah. Kelly, I'll come back to you on this also, and Kishore, you might have some thoughts. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening in the United States is that we're beginning to see the government attempt to regulate the private sector. We see this, for example, with the new proposed climate disclosure rules for the Security and Exchange Commission, or from the Security Exchange Commission, SEC. And there's been and those rules would just be requiring firms to disclose first their emissions, and then what are they doing on ESG. That's the sort of investor rule component of that. And there's been an enormous pushback against that. In fact, yesterday I saw that a new bill was introduced by, in both the House and the Senate, versions of the same bill that would explicitly prevent the SEC from proceeding with this rule, led by Republicans. And they're arguing that the argument is, and this comes back to Ying's point, the government should not be getting in the way of markets, right? But that's exactly what the SEC is trying to achieve here, which is to get this disclosure of financial risk made available, to provide that information to investors in these public companies so that people can make their own choices about whether to invest in these companies, but also to catalyze these companies to address the financial risks associated with their activities.
Kishore, did you want to add something? 'Cause I have a question, but if you wanted to, does it matter if the state of Texas pulls out of BlackRock? Like, are they?
No, I mean, personally, I would say yes. I mean, there's political pressures in the U.S., in certain states. You're absolutely right, it's happening. But you look globally, actually, that's not happening. That's actually the opposite. You look at the private sector in terms of the commitments that they've made for decarbonization for major enterprises, that's going forward. I agree in the financial sector and banks, there's issues there. But it is not as pervasive as you would think. And companies that have made these statements now are on the hook to deliver. So it's really gotten down to the implementation phase, which is how do we get this done, and what are the practical solutions that are out there that can enable this? It still is agree with the points.
Yeah. Anybody else want to tackle this? Okay, great. Yeah. Go ahead. You had a question up front here.
Hi, it's not every day that I speak to economists. So my name is Christina Kakamachimaya, a woman from southern Belize. I want to take this opportunity to ask all of you, and in particular, Walter. I'm sitting here listening to some of the solutions that you're talking about. But one of the most obvious solutions, right, is Indigenous people's land tenure systems. I haven't heard anybody speak of that. I've heard of the carbon concessions that are being proposed as a way forward. But how does Indigenous people's rights to their ancestral lands and territories factor into that proposal? Because what we see happening is governments don't have forests, right? Indigenous peoples do. But how are we making space for Indigenous peoples themselves to enter into joint ventures that will allow them to continue to live in a way that stewards their lands and forests, something that they've always done, right? And something that they will continue to do. We worried about the jobs that are going to be lost with the lumberjacks, but guess what? It's not the Indigenous people cutting down the forest.
Right.
It's the international, multinational companies that are coming onto our lands cutting down the forest. We want to keep our forest. We have kept our forest. Help us to keep it by advancing this language of Indigenous people's land tenure systems, because it's absent in the conversations when we talk economy. And so I just want to put that out there for all of you.
Walter, do you
No,
want to?
yes, you are absolutely right. And I think this is at the same models for conservation of the forest. I spoke about the Rio Cautario carbon concession in Rondônia, but there is also the Rio Terra project, 1.5 million hectares in land that belongs to 7 indigenous tribes, 7 different cultures. The beauty of this project is that it is centered on the indigenous communities, developing their own process and providing the governance, the vigilance, the maintenance systems to conserve the forests for a long term. So in both cases, Rio Terra and Rio Cautario, the key stakeholder of the carbon concession are indigenous communities. In your country of Belize, the Maya Trust Forest project is also predicated on the ability of the communities living there to exercise their power and be an important player in the conservation of that forest. We also have a project in the Monkey River Delta, where most of the people, 95% of the people are Maya, indigenous Maya, except a few non-Maya in the coast. And the center, the key stakeholder in that project also are the Maya. Their culture being respected, their ability to correlate with the land and with the resources of the land is key to the success of that project. So you are absolutely right that this has been generally absent from the dialogues, but it's changing.
It is changing.
And under Initiative 2020, the participation of indigenous communities is central to the strategies to conserve or to restore that land. But very good question. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Please.
Regarding that, I think that's an excellent question. I've been trying to emphasize how limited the scope of solutions that can be provided by economics, especially guided by neoclassical economics, because the focus is always on market, right? The solution is always market-based. That's why I think it's really important, as I'm repeating myself, the climate activism itself is actually more important in playing much crucial role in terms of shaping the overall political climate, to hold government accountable and to sometimes empower some government to take actions to regulate the private sector. So I think in that sense, I also want to mention another thing was that we have been talking about $1 trillion, you know, the damage losses can be $1 trillion, how are we going to be paying that? I would say that the scarcity issue is artificially constructed to some sense as well. Because if you look at the data, the global military spending in 2021 is $2 trillion, more than $2 trillion. So it's not really a scarcity issue, it's more about a priority issue. So I think it's really important. As an economist myself, I actually wanted to remind people to be alert about the kind of solutions we are hearing and to feel confident to challenge the very narrow cost-benefit analysis as the only way to contemplate this very important question. We probably will never find the correct price for carbon, right? Because you also could never put a price tag on people's lives. And so, but we still have to go forward, we still have to move forward. In that sense, I mean, I was actually gonna say sometimes in-kind support probably would be even more useful than money support in monetary value. If multinational corporations can return the natural resources to the commons in the global south, probably it's more constructive than sending cash money, right, in loan form or in insurance form. So I think these are the things that, I mean, again, I think it's very important to just go beyond that box, to be more bold, to think about alternatives.
Kishore?
I just want to say that one of the most impactful and exciting things that are happening right now is with indigenous communities, and especially because nature-based solutions, as Walter was saying, this offers the greatest potential to offset carbon. If you don't involve indigenous communities on defining those pathways and those programs and incentivizing them and having them directly benefit from this, none of this works out. So COP15 is about to start. I think you'll see actually the whole narrative will be much more on empowering indigenous community voices into this discussion along with the private sector.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, very good. Who gets the last word? Yeah, you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Mike Shantz. I'm here representing Friends of Alaska National Wildlife Refuges, and you might ask why. Climate change is impacting the National Wildlife Refuges in a dramatic fashion, and so we care greatly about these issues. But my question is related to the SO2 cap and trade system that has been very successful in dramatically reducing SO2 emissions, certainly in the fossil fuel sector here in the US, roughly by 95% since 1980.
That's sulfur dioxide, acid rain. Some of you are too young to remember acid rain. Go on.
Right. And so having lived through that, what are the challenges on creating a similar market-driven solution to our current carbon issues, and how can we maybe take the lessons from that successful exercise into the carbon arena?
I'm glad to start, but I think maybe Mercedes or
No.
yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that in many ways that was much simpler. That in part because there was a natural solution in that what happened when the cap was imposed on sulfur dioxide emissions, we largely shifted to low sulfur coal as the remedy. Of course, there were sort of end of the pipe stack solutions as well, but part of why that ended up being such a low cost solution was that there was a lower sulfur coal available that we could shift to. I think what we see around the world is that there are a number of well-functioning cap and trade systems for greenhouse gas emissions already, and the EU's is the most robust and biggest in the world now. But I think you're also asking why hasn't that happened here in the United States, right? And we have a couple of subnational systems, one in California and one where I live now in New England. And both have been very effective, actually, at reducing emissions. You know, bizarrely, to Ying's point, the prices have been very low. And so they haven't necessarily incentivized a lot of reduction in CO2 emissions. For example, RGGI, the regional greenhouse gas emission in the Northeast, has reduced emissions from the power sector by half. And yet the prevailing price has been less than $10 per ton. I think right now it's at like $4 a ton. Why? I think it had less to do with the actual system and much more to do with the signaling that the government was saying, we are going to reduce emissions over time and, you know, get used to that. And so all the investment decisions about replacement of coal-fired power plants and everything all of a sudden became much more clear because there was a long-term market signal that was created, whereas the actual transactions from the emissions trading regime have been, you know, not as strong as one would expect with imposing a declining cap over time. So in my view, there's a role for these systems to play. Institutionally, they're quite hard to set up and to enforce and have really good accountability in the systems. So I think they tend to work better in countries that have already, you know, experimented with these systems in the past and know how to run them. But in the United States, our problem is political. It's not that we don't know how to do this. It's just we don't have the political will to establish these. And that's why I think our approach has become a fiscal approach where we're, you know, using the Inflation Reduction Act and et cetera to try to basically use carrots rather than sticks. Because that's the only politically viable approach right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I also asked the same question to my interlocutors in Washington, D.C. Like, it's a carbon market, it's a market-based mechanism. the whole economy in the US is market-based. Why wouldn't it work here? And I think the main reason is political on both sides of the aisle for different reasons. I mean, the more conservatives didn't start from a place where they thought this was an issue, but there are conservative voices that very much support a carbon market. And on the more progressive voices, some of them will consider it a tax and taxing middle-income companies or middle-income families is not acceptable in the first place. So you've had to go for a system of incentives rather than a carbon market. But I wanted to make you aware some companies have already established this. I'm aware big corporations like Microsoft already charge a carbon price within their own operations. So when they're providing services within the company, because they have a very ambitious climate target as well, they also want to be carbon neutral, they're doing this. So when they have data centers, and that service is provided to another part of the company, they adjust the price to take into account the carbon that is produced by that data center. So there are very sophisticated models, as you were saying, going on already.
Did you want to chime in? Well, all right. We are 6.5 minutes over our limit, and I don't want to be the guy who made the conference run late. And between you and lunch also, so go eat. Thank you very much for coming. This has been very interesting.